Hello and welcome. Hello, good morning if you're in the Eastern time zone or farther west. My name is Amanda Robinson and I'm one of the co-organizers for the African Politics Conference Group Online Colloquium. And today is our first meeting of the year, of the new year. And we're really pleased to be able to discuss the work of Alex Dyzenhaus, who's been one of our most loyal APCG online colloquium participants. So it's really a pleasure to be able to discuss his work today. I believe this is part of the dissertation project, although we'll hear from Alex in a minute to tell us more about the paper. We'll have one discussant today, Danielle Resnick. She is a senior fellow and senior research fellow, and governance theme leader at the International Food Policy Research Institute. And her research focuses on the political economy of food and agriculture. So she's really a perfect discussant for this paper, and we're really thankful that she was willing to serve in that role. So I am recording the session just for APCG to be part of our channel. So just keep that in mind. Our plan will be that Alex is going to tell us a little bit about the paper, and then Danielle will offer some comments on the paper, and then we'll open it up to the larger group to ask questions or provide feedback to Alex. So once we get to that point, if you could use the raise hand function, just to, it'll help us keep track of the order of people asking questions. Okay, without further ado, I'll hand things over to Alex, and thank you, Alex, for sharing your work with us.
Yeah, and thank you, Amanda, and the rest of the organizers for putting this together. I'm really looking forward to the comments that I'm going to get from Danielle and from the rest of the presenters, or participants, sorry. So thanks all for coming. Thanks for reading the paper. This is part of my dissertation project. It served largely as my job market paper this year. And it was a project that I kind of put together during field work up until March 2020. And as we all know, fieldwork became pretty difficult and I switched to remote interviews for a little bit, but I may well be getting back to the field in the next couple of months. So, just to do some work to finish up the dissertation. So if anyone has any kind of thoughts about areas that are promising that they think that may need to be explored to strengthen the paper or strengthen the dissertation, or areas that are kind of weak that need to kind of be explored to make sure that my argument is kind of more effective, this is really like the perfect time for me to get them, because I will be going back, I will be talking to people hopefully in the next couple of weeks. So I'll be able to address them. So yeah, without kind of going on too much, looking forward to everything that you have to say.
Thanks, Alex. Yeah, Danielle, go ahead.
Okay, well, great. And thanks so much for inviting me to give comments on this super interesting paper. I think Alex and I met a few years ago, and I've been following some of your other work on land, particularly in Kenya over the years. So really excited to be part of the group today. So as I said, I really enjoyed reading this paper, and I think it really makes an important contribution to how we think about land reform in Africa and more broadly. And I think it's also especially useful for gaining leverage on, why South Africa's land reform program has really struggled. It hasn't, as Alex rightly knows, it hasn't made the progress that was hoped for when it was initiated in the mid-1990s. And I think even though most of the analysis is, focusing on something in the past, it's retrospective, looking at dynamics in the 90s and 2000s, as Alex probably knows better than any of us, the topic is still extremely salient in the country, given that just a little over a month ago, South Africa's parliament was debating the 18th constitutional amendment that would have allowed for nationalization of land, along with banks and the mining sector. And we know this is a key area of the populist EFF's platform about nationalization of land, and a growing source of contention within the ANC between the kind of reformist wing of Ramaphosa and the radical economic transformation wing of the ANC. That's kind of in alignment with the EFF. So I think it's even though it's a retrospective, it's super salient from a policy perspective today. And I also think the comparative analysis and the context of the interviews with a really broad swath of actors, from land administration to farming to processing development policy across races and ag sectors is very commendable. And the effort to be as inclusive as possible and transparent as possible in selecting the interviews really increased my own confidence in the representativeness of the findings. So kind of my areas of recommendation from the paper are really focused on making the argument a bit cleaner and offering a bit more conceptual clarity with some of the main independent variables, as well as maybe thinking about tying in some more contemporary literature on land issues, particularly from other disciplines like agricultural economics. So my first point is just when I first read the paper, I was having a little bit of trouble following the theoretical part. I think because you're introducing many different concepts and dynamics, and I felt that the argument certainly became much clearer once you get to the case studies. But one kind of, I think, easy fix for that is potentially having a figure, in the theoretical section showing how all these dynamics or variables fit together and the two different kind of outcomes that you're talking about for the sugar and the grain sector. And then I think there's a few concepts that could benefit just from a little bit more definition, because they are concepts that can be interpreted quite differently from different people. One of these is liberalization. Liberalization is quite a lumpy and continuous concept. So a government may liberalize marketing, but still provide input subsidies, and that is what a lot of African governments do now. Or they still may provide preferential trade policies, right? So you can liberalize in one domain, but not in the other. And so I think it would help to better elaborate on what conditions you see that need to be met to be characterized as liberalized. Similarly, for these concepts of centralized and decentralized organization, I was wondering if you have many unions or associations or cooperatives, but they're nonetheless organized into some apex organization, which seems to be the case in the grain sector with Grain SA. Is that really decentralized? Or would we kind of conceive that as still being centralized, that you still have one or two main actors, civil society actors that are engaging with the government over policy. And then the third concept is on sunk costs. I would have liked to see a little bit more comparison on the sunk costs between grain and sugar. You give some details for this for grain, but I didn't feel the same level of detail for sugar. And of course, sunk costs really vary. You seem to see them as equivalent to whether a processor or a producer has to pay the costs and how long it takes to realize a profit. But it's often seen by how sticky the investments are, right? So did the sugar farmer need to invest in irrigation while the maize farmer relies on rain? Or how quickly can you give up the crop to produce something else? So for instance, you can't do this quickly for tree crops like coffee or cocoa. Those are seen as the quintessential, those are the crops that have the highest sunk goods. But for grains and sugar, you can intercrop those on the same land. And they both have quite short production cycles that allow for switching somewhat quickly to a different crop alternative. So just, if you can, it's fine to have your own conceptualization of sunk costs, but I think, engaging with, there's quite a lot of kind of economics literature on that term that you may think of engaging with a bit more. Thirdly, I really appreciate that you focused on theories about ethnicity and patronage politics as an alternative theory at the end of the paper. One idea I had was perhaps organizing the paper a bit differently to actually bring that literature up front in section 2. That's kind of your main foil that you're engaging with here, and particularly expanding a bit more on that argument if others have been applying that to explain the South African case, right? Because you're really trying to show that this argument is not sufficient to explain the dynamics that you're showing. And then where you currently have these alternative arguments, I thought there right before the conclusion is where you could extend the applications of your argument. And so this may be something you are already doing, as this is part of a larger dissertation project, and you may need to, I know with the paper, you need to kind of limit the scope. But if you do think about, extending a little bit, one option is extending to other commodities in South Africa. You already start doing this tangentially, referencing timber, and how those, dynamics in that sector mirror what you're seeing in the sugar industry. But perhaps, elaborating a bit more on that and providing maybe a similar case to grain could further bolster the argument. A different approach is, thinking about the fact that you have these two key variables. You have liberalization versus what you're calling corporatism, and you have decentralization versus centralization. So this essentially, you can conceive of a 2x2 matrix with these variables, and your cases explain two of the boxes, but are there commodities in South Africa you see in the other two boxes, liberalization but centralization, and corporatism with decentralization? Or in turn, are you saying that these are really necessary and sufficient variables that need to be jointly present for the outcomes that you uncover? So I think drawing that out a little bit would increase the robustness of the argument. And then, another alternative is expanding the argument to other countries that use this market distribution program. You talk both in the appendix and in the introduction about Zimbabwe and Brazil, for example, is pursuing these market distribution programs under competitive regimes. Brazil obviously would be really interesting vis-a-vis sugar, and Zimbabwe for grain. Instead, it seemed a bit incongruous for me that you mentioned these countries in the intro and appendix as being quite similar, but then the case you allude to is Kenya when you're talking about another case study. A fourth reflection is when I was thinking about the argument, I think you go back and forth, and maybe it's certainly a reflection that is part of a broader dissertation, but trying to determine whether you want to propose a general theory about land distribution or whether you're specifically concerned about this puzzle in South Africa. And I ask this because there seem to be a lot of peculiarities about the sectors in the country and the dynamics of the land reform process in South Africa that may not be as relevant to other places. So for instance, the concentration of production and processing of sugar is not necessarily specific to the commodity. Uganda, for instance, has gone from having 3 to 33 sugar mills in the last 3 decades, has many, many producers involved in the sector. It's expanded land through conversion of forest into sugarcane and conversion of cropland into sugarcane. And the biggest controversy there is that there's limited coordination at the production level that in turn reduces farmers' bargaining capacity. So that's very different from the centralized bargaining you're observing for sugar in South Africa. And then similarly, on the grain side, you're claiming farmers can wait, that there's this big difference because farmers in the grain sector can wait to sell their product, while sugar producers have to act quickly. They have to get it to the mills quickly. But the other issue with grain is that it has a much longer supply chain. It needs to be husked, crushed, and milled before it can actually be sold. And so there's often many more middlemen involved in the transactions. And you often find grain farmers are very worried about losing out in the process to these middlemen. This has been the key controversial issue in India, where Modi's government's been trying to liberalize market procurement over the last 2 years, only for it to be thwarted exactly by grain farmers who are worried that liberalization is going to undercut them by middlemen, and they want to have the state markets to be retained. So, in other words, the dynamics you're observing across these two sectors may be linked more to how the value chains are structured in South Africa, rather than features of the commodities that in turn dictate organizing behaviors and policy preferences from the state. And relatedly, I was curious about how much the South Africa's program, land reform program, which seemed to involve not only providing land to Black farmers, but also providing them with economic support for a period to keep them viable players. How much that component of the reform program plays a role in your story, especially as you note that doing this kind of created reservations for the government in the grain sector, because they knew that some of the land they were buying, wouldn't be viable. They'd have to provide a lot of support to the grain farmers in order to make it a viable transaction. And then, the last part of this argument about whether it's a broader argument about land distribution or particular to South Africa, is this issue about how much depends on the racial dimensions of South Africa's regime transition, as it seems that some of the decisions about whether to liberalize, as you've explained it, revolved around concerns about expropriation by an untested, at the time, ANC government that particularly white grain farmers thought would be antagonistic to their industry. So do we think the argument's purely related to agricultural institutions or also to the uncertainty that accompanies regime transitions, as you had this dual dynamic occurring. Just a few more comments, and Amanda, cut me off whenever. I think, I like the puzzle you really clearly highlighted with your data. 26% of the land for sugar sector transferred in KZN, and only 6% in the grain sector in the Free State. But you go back and forth, in terms of how representative you want to say these dimensions are. You claim that this trend is not really specific to these provinces, but rather to the commodity sectors. And you note that you actually interview respondents who had experiences in other parts of the country. So I wondered about the feasibility of actually calculating the numbers of land transfers in their totality for the sectors, and present the puzzle from kind of a national perspective rather than a provincial one. And I think this could be important to support your dismissal of the alternative hypotheses on ethnicity and patronage, because you claim later that, well, because sugar is also grown in Mpumalanga, you can dismiss that the ANC was trying to court producers in KZN to wrest votes away from the Inkatha Freedom Party. But by predominantly focusing on KZN through most of the analysis, this kind of alternative argument becomes a little bit less convincing in that regard. So just is it feasible to do that calculation across the sectors rather than just at a provincial level? Now, towards the conclusion, you were noting the contribution of the work, and I think there's a lot of great contributions of this work. And you highlight that contradictory to a lot of the theories on democratization, where you see landed elites as being a major impediment to democratic transitions. You're really showing that democracies can be good at distributing land. And I really liked this angle, but as I thought about it more, I was wondering about how parallel the situations actually are, because the work that you're citing of Moore and Bosch and others is really focused on authoritarian states with landed elites, while your cases are focused on an already democratic setting with landed elites. But of course, the correct comparison for me is the apartheid era scenario, which is very similar to what they were observing under authoritarianism in Latin America and Southern Europe and elsewhere, where in that case, you did obviously see resistance by landed white elites to democratization in South Africa. So I'm just wondering about if you can, expand on that contribution a little bit more, so that it's not seen that you're kind of comparing apples and oranges in a sense. And then finally, I think there's some literature from agricultural economics that you may want to bring in. There's been a lot more contemporary literature on land and agriculture focusing on land grabs, and these dimensions of land distribution for foreign investors who are focusing on agro-industry, and on the consolidation of land among medium-sized farmers in places like Ghana and Zambia. So work by Tom Jane and his colleagues at Michigan State University could be quite useful. And then similarly, I really like that you've gone beyond this quite outdated thinking from Bates and others, about producers versus consumers. And you're really thinking about the relationships between producers and processors as well. I mean, there's many different actors, right, in the value chain. And a lot of economists have been thinking a lot about this, particularly looking at global value chains and the shifting political economy of coalitions as a result of those, highlighting how producers align with processors and retailers sometimes, or sometimes the producers and retailers align against processors. So in my written notes, I have a few suggested references that you could look at to kind of bolster your more nuanced and I think fresh thinking about these dynamics. So I'm going to stop there, but again, really enjoy the paper. I think it's a very fresh take on an old problem in the region.
Thanks, Danielle. Alex, I was going to suggest if there's anything that you want to respond to from Danielle's comments that you think would be productive for the broader conversation, you could do that now before we open up to other questions. It's up to you.
Yeah. These are really helpful comments. Thank you very much. I'm not an agricultural economist, so any suggestions on that kind of literature is good, because every time I go in, I can only kind of scratch the surface. I think I'll address the data question really quickly. So I would love to be presenting you with the full kind of countrywide data. I've struggled a lot, or I was struggling a lot with the department to get the data before COVID, and then when COVID hit, it kind of, the email chain just slowly fizzled out. And there are just a number of complications with the different branches of the land reform and different levels of reporting and different ways of reporting land redistribution that make it hard to compare across those. And so at the end of the day, the Free State and KZN end up having the kind of right dynamics, kind of luckily, because they're the provinces that I kind of got data for, in terms of being able to compare. Because a lot of if I was able to get the redistribution data, it would be hard to present it from Mpumalanga, because in Mpumalanga, it's been all land restitution. And so it kind of gets a little bit messy, and this is the best I've got right now. I'm going to make a kind of more concerted attempt to get better data when I go back. But these things are kind of quite hard to do when you're not being physically present and pestering people, as we all know from all of our attempts to deal with government bureaucracies around the world. But yeah, thank you. I'll kind of think more about these and respond to them maybe a little bit later.
Okay, great. Thanks, Alex. So if you would like to ask a question or provide some feedback, if you could use the raise hand function at the bottom under reactions. And Alex, you can fill those, or I can, depending on your preference. Who wants to start us off? Go ahead, Adam.
Okay, great. Thanks. Thanks, Alex. I really enjoyed the paper, and it's super fascinating stuff. And just echoing Danielle's point that, as you already know, this is extremely salient and an important topic, and it was really exciting to read. So just a few things. I wanted to second Danielle's comments on theory. I also found myself getting lost in some of the terminology, but I also thought that it might be nice to have some examples that are not your two cases of South Africa kind of peppered throughout the theory to help us that are a little less deep in the theory of all of this to kind of get sink our teeth into, that would kind of help hold our hand as we're thinking through this. You had a couple, they're a bit vague. You had one on cattle farming and then another one throughout, but I think more of that and even more concrete examples would help. And then I had, so then at the end of the day, I'm convinced and I buy your story, but sometimes I'm not sure what exactly is doing the work here. So the way that you kind of tell the story is thinking about how these two sectors react to the policy shock of democracy, right? Of the ANC coming into power, right? And so I didn't feel like it was fully explained to me why, I mean, they're all white farmers. So why is it that the grain farmers were so much more worried about the uncertainty of a new majority Black government where sugar farmers seem less worried? Is it the fact that the sugar farmers just didn't have the space to be worried and they had to be aligned with the state? There was no other way to survive? Because I'm wondering if part of your story that is part of the narrative but not identified as a key variable is this kind of reaction to policy shocks or reaction to uncertainty, right? That are characterized by the same characteristics of the different sectors that interact with uncertainty and kind of policy shocks. I was trying to like figure out, is it this liberalization and organization or centralization that matters? Or is it how this interacts with uncertainty and your ability to kind of be worried about this new government? And with that, I know others can say if they disagree with me, but I'm not sure that you're presenting this as liberalization and centralization is necessary or helpful. I found myself trying to figure out what you meant by liberalization as we were kind of going along. This is one of these terms that is kind of hard to pin down a lot. But then on page 15, you actually directly associate these overall terms with characteristics of the sectors, right? You say sunk costs underlie liberalization and crop storage underlies organization, right? So why not just focus on sunk costs and maybe crop storage? But actually what I think is actually going on with organization is mutual dependence, right? The producers have a lot of control in the sugar sector, but they're also highly dependent on sugar producers actually producing in a timely manner, right? As you say, so I don't know if a way of thinking about this is how the way the sugar sector is structured, at least in South Africa, is has this intense mutual dependence. And maybe that's something to kind of think about. If that's of interest, Lauren Honig and myself have a paper. It's very different, but we explore this idea of mutual dependence. And if you're interested, I'm happy to send it along. But yeah, I think that was it. Oh, and then just the other thing, this is a bit random, but again, with the examples that my first comment asking for examples, it was much easier for me to follow the sugar story just because I had watched that show on OWN called Queen Sugar, and it made a lot of sense to me. Otherwise, it was very hard for me to grasp what was going on otherwise. So the examples are really helpful throughout. But yes, again, thanks for a fantastic paper, and I look forward to seeing how it continues to progress.
Alex, should we gather a few, maybe hear from Robert and Megan, and then have you respond as the kind of a group to whatever you feel like you should?
That sounds great. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, let's go ahead, Robert.
Great, thanks very much. Thank you, Alex, as well, for this paper. It's very, very interesting, you know, and having spent some of my childhood in the area around Durban, you know, in Howick, it was quite nice to read about the sugar industry as well. So my comments are just a bit different, you know, they're regarding the political, electoral kind of context of the country. So, you know, I think, you know, any time you've got case studies, you are always thinking, right, about the rival hypotheses. And on page 12, you said that the ANC had no real incentive to use land redistribution. I think I'd maybe push back just a bit on this. You know, I think if you look at the electoral dynamics in KwaZulu-Natal, in 2016, the ANC loses quite a lot of the municipalities to the IFP. It loses the majority coalition in a lot of these municipalities. In 2019, in the national election, the ANC, I think they win 54% of the vote in KZN. But if you compare KZN to the Free States, right, in the Free State, the ANC doesn't lose these municipalities in 2016. 2019, its vote's quite stable. And then in 2021, the ANC does even worse in KZN to opposition parties, and you even have they're a very tiny party, but their name is actually Team Sugar SA, and they get about 27,000 votes in 2021. So the dynamics, I think, are that the ANC is facing significant political pressure in KZN. That's important in the sense that it relates back to land reform, because in 2019, the ANC moved quite a bit leftward on land reform policy, right? They're facing challenges from the EFF, and then they say, look, you know, we've got to open up this constitutional question, and we've got to consider, you know, even thinking about land expropriation. So I think there is quite a dynamic within the country, but specifically at the subnational level in KZN, that the ANC is facing quite a bit of pressure from the opposition to do more on the land situation. So I'm just thinking perhaps, you know, a bit more to kind of discount the electoral dynamics, or to kind of say that the rival hypothesis isn't quite as strong as perhaps it might be.
Thanks. Go ahead, Megan.
Great. Hi. It's really nice to see you again, Alex, and to see your work in writing and how far the project has come. So I would echo Danielle's comments about bringing conceptual and theoretical clarity to the paper. Throughout the theory section, I found myself sort of getting a bit lost in like what actually mattered for you. And there seemed to be like some discussions or elements in the theory section that seems sort of peripheral to your argument. And like these were interesting like comments. And I have like notes where this was in the paper, and I'll send them to you. But I found myself a little confused at the end of the theory section and like what I should be focusing on when we got to the case studies. And I similar to Danielle's comments, I think a diagram or figure would be like really helpful for the reader. I also had some thoughts about strengthening your discussion of the case selection strategy. So for me, I always find this paper by Seawright and Gehring on case selection strategy to be really helpful for thinking about like, what are the goals of my research paper and like the contributions to the literature that I want to make, and how does that connect to the case selection strategy that I'm using, whether it's like most similar in most different cases, or an outlier case or a representative case. So I think that would strengthen the paper, at least the research design section of it, and help the reader kind of figure out like what we're supposed to take away from these cases and what it means for like the larger population of cases. And also, depending on your case selection strategy, it might help you also take care of some alternative explanations, right? To say like, because I'm selecting cases in this way, especially if they're like most similar cases, they're matched on like these other theoretically relevant explanations, but because they're constant across these cases, they're not doing a great job of explaining the variation I'm interested in. So, I mean, depending on whether this is going to stay like a dissertation chapter, or like go out for review, I think you might win over reviewers if you're able to kind of speak more to like these rival explanations and like tighten up your discussion of the case selection strategy. Something else I would like to see in the paper, and if it was in the appendix, I missed it. I missed it. I didn't read the appendix, so I apologize for overlooking it. But I would also like more of a discussion of how you're operationalizing your variables in the research design and data and measurement section. So like, how do we know like what a centralized system looks like, and decentralized and liberalized, and so on and so forth. And the last thing I'll say is I really like, I love interview data. I love doing interviews, but I think it would help strengthen the paper if you could like corroborate the findings from your interviews with like other sources of information. So you can, say to readers and reviewers like, yeah, so like I see a number of interviewees like mentioning this theme a lot, but if you look at like reports from like local think tanks that focus on like different economic sectors, or if you're looking at like local journalists or outlets that are covering the economy, right, and the agricultural sector in South Africa, like they're also picking up on these things. So it's not just from my interview sources, but you're able to marshal other kinds of evidence to like, just make a more compelling case. I think that would probably help the paper as well. Anyway, I'll stop there. I have a few notes. I'll send them to you. They're kind of nitpicky, but I really enjoyed the paper, and I felt like I learned quite a bit about agricultural politics in South Africa, so thanks.
Thanks, Megan. All right, Alex, do you want to respond to anything from those three while we wait for other folks to raise their hand?
Yeah, so I think I'll make one kind of big comment and then one or two smaller comments. The big comment kind of goes back to something that Danielle said that's being echoed by a lot of people, which is kind of thinking about this in terms of a diagram or other cases and examples. So there is a typology that was originally in this paper, and it's kind of a big part of the dissertation that does lay these out and lay out different sectors and where they might fit in the typology. I found that in terms of this being a standalone paper, it ended up being very distracting, and I spent almost way too much time trying to justify the typology, and then it leaves open a number of questions. So I kind of rewrote the theory bit, and maybe that's why it needs a little bit more ironing out. But it's good to know that I need to kind of go back on that and focus on it. One thing that Nick has been trying to get me to do for a very long time is include more examples from different branches of the typology, more examples that aren't just my cases. And I'm starting to develop that now. So it's good to hear that again. And I think, Adam, if you're at the LSE workshop next week, you'll be seeing a presentation on this. So you'll get to get to hammer me again on those. On the specific issues to do with South African elections, I think you're right that there are definitely local dynamics in KZN that are really unique. And I think that what kind of makes me think that those aren't driving the sugar redistribution in particular is that the sugar redistribution happens kind of after the initial IFP surge, but before the Zuma era and before the kind of new challenge at the local level. And so, I mean, I definitely think that there could be drivers of land redistribution in South Africa that are patronage driven, that are to do with kind of ANC internal politics. But I don't think that they're necessarily explaining these two areas, and especially the fact that Mpumalanga has seen just as much redistribution in the sugar sector, when Mpumalanga kind of resembles the Free State more politically than KZN does in terms of kind of ANC domination. So yeah, these are all very helpful comments.
Okay, other folks have questions, suggestions, feedback? Yes. Rory-san, and then Natalie.
Sorry, I'm not using my video. I have bad connection, but thanks so much, Alex. It's great to see the paper evolving. Some of my points were already addressed earlier, so I just wanted to make two quick ones. The first being that I would have liked to see more about like the relative productivity of each sector earlier on. I think that did come across in your discussion of the cases, but maybe in section 4.1, where you were kind of explaining what your choice of the two, so that it can kind of foreground that, because it was something that I wondered immediately. In addition to thinking about the same kind of dynamics about like the sunk costs of being able to just simply choose another crop. And then the second small point is, I just started wondering what makes ranching different from the sectors that you talk about, because there's a line that mentions that, or implies that there was a fair amount of redistribution in this sector. And then I wondered if that fit in your argument in any way, or if it's purely a matter of land productivity as opposed to these kind of institutions. So that's it for me. Thanks.
Thanks, Natalie.
Hi, Alex. Thanks for sharing this paper. I really enjoyed reading it. I'm like hesitant to add comments because I don't think I'm going to say anything new here. Everything that I wrote down was covered first by Danielle and then reinforced by others. But sometimes hearing it like 3 times, it really is like a vote, like this is something that should, be focused on. In general, I thought it was like a really solid, strong paper. I was really sort of convinced by your argument. But just like others have said, I'm glad that Nick also has been saying this. I oftentimes find myself agreeing with his advice, that examples would be so helpful, because it's sort of like a jargon heavy paper, but not in like, sometimes papers just need to be a little bit jargon heavy, and I think that's fine. But in order to like reinforce that jargon, having examples is so helpful. So like you had one, like in the upfront part, I recall one example, and I think there was really only one in that section about the cattle industry, and that example, it was only a couple of sentences, didn't take up a huge amount of space, but was really illuminating for thinking about the dynamics that you were trying to explain. And so like little examples like that I think would be really helpful. And in particular, if you could use these kinds of examples to highlight the range of values on your different variables. And again, this has sort of been said in different ways by others. But, like in terms of things like sunk costs or liberalization or the other sort of key variables and terms that you're dealing with, where does grain fall on a spectrum of like all crops? Where does sugar fall on a spectrum of all crops? Are they actually kind of close to each other? Are they very far away? How does it compare to cocoa? How does it compare to, and obviously like you don't have to consider every crop in the world, but giving us a sense of what extreme values are and where grain and sugar fall on that spectrum would be like immensely helpful. And then related to that is this idea of the scope conditions in general and what is the full universe of cases. And I think you do some of this work in the appendix, but maybe highlighting that a little bit more upfront in the main text would be helpful, particularly in regards to not universalizing this theory a little bit more, but again, as others have said, maybe thinking outside of the South Africa box in a more structured way. And And then Danielle also mentioned this, but bringing that section at the end, I want to double down on that alternative hypothesis about electoral politics up front, because I read the like, you have a very short section about it in the front end of the paper. And I had all these questions like, oh, but what about subnational politics? What about, and then I got to the end and I was like, oh, he's thought about all of this. And here are the answers to all of my questions. And that's always like a pet peeve of mine when I've like thought of all of these critiques and then they're all answered, but like much later in the paper, like bring that up or at least foreshadow it in that first section, because splitting them is a little bit confusing. But otherwise, again, I really enjoyed this paper and I learned a lot too. This isn't my wheelhouse of expertise. And so I really enjoyed learning about agricultural politics in South Africa.
Thanks, Natalie. Dylan, please go ahead.
Hi, and seconding many other comments that I really enjoyed the paper, and the kind of level of granular knowledge about the case was both remarkable and also, I think quite inspiring. It was really cool to see so much work being done on kind of understanding the nuts and bolts of the political economy of the situation. So really well done. Echoing many points other people have made, but I guess two somewhat different ones. The first is I would have been really interested to kind of understand a broader cross-section of outcomes, not just conditional on the government asking for redistribution, what is a particular sector's response, but how does the different sectoral configurations influence their other political activities that might have affected redistribution. So you might imagine that conditional on the government asking for redistribution, some sectors are quite willing to give it up. I would have been interested to know if we had a different country with a much higher concentration of sectors similar to the sugar sector, maybe requests for land redistribution might be more difficult because they might have been better able to kind of coordinate on pressuring the government not to engage in such a program in the first place. So I would have really liked to see a kind of broader cross-section of outcomes around land redistribution, or at least discussion of them, and then also using that to talk about what that would lead us to predict in other countries, which might not just have some sectors are different, but different concentrations of those types of sectors. So again, thank you very much. I thought it was a wonderful paper.
Go ahead, Alex, and then we'll maybe do one more round.
Yeah, so again, these questions or comments are all really, really helpful. To go back, I think a kind of common thread throughout this is kind of thinking about how different sectors in different countries that are, the same sectors that I'm talking about, but maybe different organized, or sectors within South Africa that may be differently organized, could be in part answered by more examples. But I think there's also a line that I'm trying to walk in a way, which is that I'm trying to propose a kind of general theory using very specific factors in South Africa, as Danielle mentioned in the initial comments. And I think what I'm trying to do, and maybe not doing it hugely effectively, is saying that given these dynamics of agricultural sectors, you should expect those dynamics to be influencing. So it may be a very kind of abstracted, generalizable kind of point. And so I think, the very decentralized sugar production that Danielle mentioned, Uganda would have different effects in a sort of agricultural policy sphere. The issue then that I struggle with is that I'm also at times probably implying or trying to say that, the biological features of a crop will be determining these as well. So I've got to try and find a way to tie that together. And so I think that a lot of people have been pushing me to kind of be clearer on this. And I think that's probably a very good way to go forward. But yeah.
Okay, Danielle, go ahead, and then I'll put myself in the queue too.
Oh, well, why don't you go ahead?
No, go ahead. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, no, I mean, just on that last point, Alex, I mean, I don't know how much you need to go into the details of the biological dimensions of the crops. I mean, I think it's maybe enough to look at the market structure, which of course is partially, not exclusively, but partially determined by those biological structures. I mean, as you noted, like, you need to have mills close to sugar producers because it needs to be like harvested within 24 hours. But I don't know if you need to go into all of that component. I think kind of just looking at, is it kind of concentrated or diffuse, market power within the value chain could be sufficient to draw out some of the other implications of the theorizing you're talking about. And then it's not really, doesn't need to be limited to, my critique about, well, you wouldn't see the same dynamic for sugar in Uganda. But if we're talking about like concentrated versus diffuse, market structure, instead of sugar versus grain, then, this can travel perhaps a little bit more and not have, as many caveats regarding commodities.
Thanks, Danielle. Alex, as others have said, it's a great paper. I think, most of the feedback you're getting is around framing and how you might, make this more generalizable or clearer, but it's a really strong paper and really interesting. And I think there's going to be a large audience for it. I have 3 questions, suggestions, or points, I guess. The first is related to things that that others have said, but I kind of thought about it a little differently. So in the paper you set up, there's like these factors related to these 2 different crops that give rise to these intermediate variables that you think shape the proportion of land that's redistributed. So that you have the centralization and the liberalization as these kind of mediating factors, and then things that go into, explaining why the sugar and the grain sectors look differently, specific to the South African case. And Danielle is pushing you to think about kind of decoupling those, because I think in the current setup, it's hard to know whether it's really the centralization and the liberalization or whether it's those conditions that gave rise to those particular institutions. And so if you had other cases, even in a kind of superficial framing way where you say, in places where there's a different set of factors, but you still end up with centralization and liberalization, we see similar patterns. And so trying to separate out those initial conditions that give rise to the institutional outcomes that you see that you think then shape land redistribution, I think would be useful in the larger dissertation or project, just to make sure that it's not the biological factors that shape something about the likelihood of land distribution, and is really about these intermediate variables of centralization and liberalization. The second point is, when I was reading the theoretical section and your argument about centralization, I thought a priori it could have gone in the other direction, where highly coordinated sector would be able to resist land redistribution. I was convinced and going through the evidence for why that's not the case, but when reading the theory, I was kind of like, oh, it's not obvious to me that having this highly centralized structure would mean that you'd be more receptive to or responsive to this push for redistribution. And so maybe in other contexts that might not be the case. And then finally, maybe a little bit out of left field, but in the setup, obviously in South Africa, the demands for redistribution have this racial component that I think is different than many other contexts where land redistribution is being demanded or implemented. And I wondered if there's any ways in which that makes this a unique case. So one possibility, and this is something Adam Harris is thinking a lot about, and I in my own work around visibility. So land being, moved from a white farmer to a black farmer is visible to people in a way that perhaps interclass redistribution would be less visible to people around. I don't know if that would matter, or if there's something symbolic during the apartheid era about white ownership of sugar production versus grain production. Like, you can imagine that a staple crop could be more salient, or a cash crop could be more salient. I don't know if there's just anything symbolic here about the particulars of land redistribution that might shape things differently in a place where there's not this racial component to the redistribution. All right, I'll stop there. Other thoughts before we maybe ask Alex to respond? Constantine, did you not have a question?
Hi, Amanda. Hi, everyone. Yes, I did. And hi, Alex. As I told you yesterday, I really loved reading the paper. I think it's very well written. I learned a lot about South African politics as a result of the paper. And I really love how you walk through the reader in kind of, adjudicating between the hypothesis that you propose versus these other alternative theories. And I apologize if somebody did already say this, then I'm sorry. But I think to me, one of the things that I thought is to kind of like simplify the mechanism even further, because it seems to me the sunk cost is the main thing, right? And it doesn't read like that at the beginning, right? You talk about the nature of the markets for these crops, but you don't focus on the underlying mechanism being like the sunk cost argument, which I think is a neat, easier thing that I think you should emphasize much sooner and more prominently, because I think that's where the bite comes. But otherwise, very well done. It's really, really hard. I've never seen such a great, especially from like a PhD candidate like we are now, such a great qualitative piece of work that just gives you a lot of depth, but is still incredibly rich in the stories that you're telling, but also not being completely blind to some of the causal inferential kind of I don't know what are they called these days? It was like randomistas, whatever is the new term for that kind of school of thought. But yeah, I thought it was very, very well done, Alex. Great job.
Thanks, Constantine. Sorry for calling you out, but I'm glad you weighed in. All right, Alex, we have a few more minutes if there's anything you want to respond to or anything you want to say in general before we sign off.
No, I think this has been really helpful. Thanks to everyone for your comments. I think my brain's all in knots, and I'll spend the next couple of weeks before heading back to South Africa kind of trying to untie those and trying to get to kind of write the rest of this dissertation. But yeah, thank you, everyone.
Thanks so much, Alex, for sharing this work. And thanks especially to Danielle for great comments. Thanks everybody for joining and participating, and hope to see you in future APCG colloquia.
Thanks everyone. Bye.
Thank you, Amanda, for sharing. Thanks, everyone.